Welcome to a time when there were no guitars and no drums, just synthesizers. It was the 1970s. The place was Britain, and our heroes were a maverick bunch of young pioneers, obsessed by Kraftwerk and science fiction. All across the country, these synthetic dreamers would imagine the very sound of the future yesterday. And by the 80s, their dreams would become a reality as Britain went synth-pop. Welcome to a time when machines ruled the world. By the 1970s, we were living in the future. Our cities were going space age. Victorian slums had been torn down and replaced by ultra-modern concrete high-rises. Entertainment also looked to the future. Our cinema and television screens were full of tantalising glimpses of a future that seemed just around the corner. Released in 1971, Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange was a futuristic and violent vision of concrete Britain that captured the zeitgeist. The film's soundtrack was composed by American synth pioneer Walter, now Wendy Carlos. It would have a profound effect on a generation of would-be musicians.
That was probably a lot of people's maybe first time they'd heard electronic music, you know, on the score to that film. It made me forever associate classical music with people getting their heads kicked in, which is kind of a bit strange.
The soundtrack to Clockwork Orange, fantastic synth sounds in that, you know, big Moog synthesizer that Wendy Carlos used. And they were all orchestrated.
Well, Wendy, who then said she was Walter, I've never quite worked out what was going on there, was an absolute inspiration, you know. And the first time we'd ever heard that sort of absorbent synth-based sound, just raved about it.
Some of the people who would be the future post-punk people would listen to the 3 or 4 sort of original compositions that Carlos did on that soundtrack that were much more sinister and foreboding. There was a kind of a linkage made there between those sounds and the idea of a cold future, a bleak future, and that probably sort of sunk quite deeply into the psyche of a lot of young musicians at that time.
For a generation of electronic dreamers, Carlos's soundtrack would offer a glimpse of an alienated synthetic future. But the true divine spark would arrive on our television screens in 1975. Tomorrow's World gave Britain its first glimpse of Kraftwerk, a German band who played only electronic instruments. They would invade our shores later the same year.
We played one of our first gigs, 1975, of our English tour in Liverpool. The Wings Over Britain tour was playing the same night in the town. That was also the reason why our hall was only half crowded. All of our posters were stuck right next to the posters of the Wings, so it made us proud, of course, you know.
Amazingly, they came to Liverpool in October of '75, and I sat in seat Q36 and witnessed the first day of the rest of my life. '75 was all, you know, the era of long hair and flared trousers and guitar solos, and these guys all came out in suits and ties. 2 of them looked like they were playing electronic tea trays with wired up knitting needles, and I was just blown away. It was incredible.
We had no long hair, we didn't wear blue jeans, we had suits on, grey suits, short hair, you know, and we looked like the children of Werner von Braun or Werner von Siemens. And we saw us so, you know, engineer musicians like that, instead of dancing boys on the stage to arouse the girls, you know. The interesting thing afterwards, there was a knock at our backstage door. It was a band. They were called Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. And the leader, Eddie McCluskey, was really astonished and happy that he was meeting us in person. And he said, "You know, guys, you have shown us the future. This is it. We throw away our guitars tomorrow and buy all synthesizers."
In terms of inspiring people to not just have a synthesizer in their rock band, but to be completely electronic, I think you can never underestimate the impact of Kraftwerk. Trans-Europe Express had the same impact on the synth poppers that Anarchy in the UK had on people who wanted to be punk rockers.
Next year, Kraftwerk hope to eliminate the keyboards altogether and build jackets with electronic lapels which can be played by touch.
In British music in the mid-70s, the synth was a remote beast. Although they would become much cheaper later in the decade, a synthesizer then could cost as much as a small house. They were associated with rich and technically gifted, progressive musicians.
Until punk came along, you had to be Keith Emerson. If you wanted to be in a band, you had to have learnt your instrument for at least 8 or 9 years before you would dare come out and play it. And it was simply the inspiration of The Damned and The Clash that said, get up and do it, you know. Do your best. If it's crap, maybe the simplicity will get you through.
Whilst the music didn't concern itself with synthesizers, the attitude of the punk movement would inspire those with an interest in electronic music to do it themselves.
All the infrastructure around punk we absolutely loved. It's just that the actual music we saw as being quite old-fashioned and being a bit of a one-trick pony. So what we did was we took the attitudes of punk and gave it a different context, i.e. let's make music that nobody's heard before.
Across the country, small pockets of experimentation surfaced, inspired primarily by punk and Kraftwerk.
We're in my studio at home in southeast London. One day I opened my email inbox and there was like 10 emails from a very disparate bunch of people saying, you've got to go to eBay now and buy this. And what it was Kraftwerk's original vocoder, which was being sold on eBay. And it was the one that was used on Autobahn. I thought, well, this is the equivalent for a guitarist of getting Jimi Hendrix's guitar that was used on Purple Haze or something, you know. I first got a synthesizer in 1977, and I bought a second-hand called 700S from Macari's music shop in Charing Cross Road. The thing that pissed me off about punk was that you had to learn 3 chords to be in a punk band. If you had a synthesizer, all you had to do was press 1 key with a finger, you know.
Advances in technology in the late 70s heralded the invention of the affordable synth, costing no more than an electric guitar. Daniel Miller used his to form The Normal, an experimental act that supported punk groups. Miller drew on the work of English author J.G. Ballard, whose Crash was another futuristic vision of Britain.
I'd just broken up with a girlfriend who I was very much in love with, and a friend of mine said, "Oh, read this book." I don't know, and I read it, and it sort of really had a huge, I don't want to use all these puns like impact, but it had a huge impact on it. It wasn't like science fiction in the sense that it was outer space and stuff like that. It felt like it was 5 minutes into the future, and I loved that aspect of it, the fact that it was kind of so outrageous but so possible at the same time.
Warm Leatherette by The Normal. The Normal was the alias of Daniel Miller. The lyrics are just a précis of some of the concepts in in Crash, Ballard's novel, which was about people who have car accidents and find that thereafter their sexuality has been diverted and they're obsessed with being turned on by car crashes. So, you know, the lyric like, the handbrake penetrates your thigh, quick, let's make love before you die.
The music was supposed to be visual, you know, like driving along a highway with big buildings either side and going into a tunnel. There's quite a lot of humour in it, really. I mean, it wasn't meant to be like apocalyptic or dystopian.
Miller was one of Britain's first synth punks, and he wasn't alone. In the north of England, a bunch of computer programmers dreamt of a similar future.
Well, we love J.G. Ballard, and in fact, you know, Roxy had a song 2HB about Humphrey Bogart, and we had a song for J.G., which was about J.G. Ballard.
The Future were a bunch of sci-fi nerds from Sheffield. They formed in '77 and played only synthesizers.
When I bought my Korg 700S in 1976, it was the first time there was a monophonic synthesizer which you could do stuff with, which was kind of domestic level, entry level in terms of price. It was 350 quid, I think. And I remember distinctly thinking at the time, I was a computer operator, and there was a decision day where it was either buy a second-hand car and learn to drive, or go and buy this monophonic synthesizer. And that proved to be quite a fateful day, because I still can't drive, but I still got that synthesizer.
This is a Mini Korg 700S, and was sort of the first affordable synth. A fantastic machine, completely eccentric. Listen to the voice of Buddha. They give you a book of patches with it, and because it was Japanese, that there would be things like Synthy Cat or Funny Frog, you know, and you can't follow why it's doing what it does, but it sounds great.
Usually with a synthesizer, you can get it to do something for you that you don't have to be manually good at all. So we use these things, and you can press a switch on them, and they'll do things for about 10 minutes. It's quite interesting. If you've got a tape recorder, you can put it down, put something next to it, and it'll sound all right.
The day that I joined the band, Martin came round to my house, and he had two records under his arm. One was Trans-Europe Express, and one was I Feel Love. And he said, "Look, we can do this." I think that was his actual phrase.
We loved all that stuff. I mean, like the concept albums that George Moroder did with Donna Summer. We used to play those continuously. And this wasn't some kind of post-gay, ironic thing. It's just because they sounded great and interesting, and you're never really sure what the next set of sounds coming up was going to be.
I Feel Love just didn't sound like any record that had been before. It came on the radio, and you couldn't quite believe what you were hearing. It was hypnotic, but it was driving.
Moroder's Moog Music was the disco single of '77. Its success would set the template for the future of the future.
We were, in fact, much more influenced by Moroder than we were by Kraftwerk. Everyone, ever since anyone that knows we use synths, "Oh, you sound like Kraftwerk, don't you?" Well, we use the same instruments, so some of the sounds are a bit the same. We never really wanted to be Kraftwerk. We wanted to be a pop band.
We wanted to embody a sense of futurism without being so literal. And it just so happened a friend of ours, he had bought for him this science fiction board game called Star Force. And it was prodigiously tedious. I mean, it was real geek stuff. And it was impenetrable. You couldn't play it. There was the Rise of the Human League or something. And we thought, the Human League, that is such a cool name.
No future, they say. The Human League set out to make electronic pop for the modern city. Now is calling. The city is human. Blind you take hope, you're no joke, so your time is human, but come soon. We've had it easy, we should be glad. High-rise living's not so bad.
The Human League had a totally different spin on synthesizers, where it was much more like this bright, technocratic optimism.
I'd say most of the brightness came from Martin. Martin's very optimistic, and if anyone's moaning about anything, Martin will go and write a song in the opposite direction. I think I felt a bit gloomy about the concrete jungle and everything, which is ridiculous because I'm a townie. You know, I gravitate towards concrete, if you put me in the country, I would just find the nearest town and go, and I'll be sitting in a bar quite quickly.
Blind you take hope, you're no joke, so your time is through, big fun comes soon.
Unfortunately, British pop music wasn't quite ready for a synth-led group of futurists just yet. But in 1978, the Human League weren't the only group experimenting with electronics in Sheffield.
This is the old Salter Lane Art College, which used to be part of Sheffield Polytechnic in the 1970s. I believe the Human League also played this very place for their first ever live show in Sheffield. Cabaret Voltaire did perform in this very room. Yeah, I mean, we just thought there was nothing for us, you know. I mean, it was all kind of bloated super groups and progressive bands who weren't even from the same kind of social backgrounds, you know. They were probably public school educated, whereas I think, you know, most of the scene in Sheffield was pretty solid, kind of working class. You'd find little bits of interesting music within perhaps some of the prog rock stuff where there'd be a weird little synth break. But then, you know, once you kind of start to discover all the German bands, you realise that there were entire albums that were made of electronics.
Whilst the Human League dreamt of pop, Cabaret Voltaire were anything but, using electronics to explore Sheffield, a city torn between the past and the future.
I remember watching loads of science fiction things in the 60s, like Doctor Who and things like Quatermass. And all these kind of strange things seem to happen in kind of old gasworks or industrial environment. There was an otherworldliness about it. You might see an alien or a giant blob creeping across the floor, glowing bright green from radioactivity.
Very arty group. Obviously their name echoes Dada. They were really into William Burroughs and his ideas of like control and surveillance. They actually used quite a lot of guitar, but it was so heavily processed it didn't sound like rock and roll guitar. It sounded more like a synthesizer. They also put synthesizing type effects on the voice, which is probably one of the most disturbing things they did. You know, you have a guy singing, but it sounds more like a Dalek than, you know, a human being.
At night time, you'd hear distant booming noises, which, you know, would probably be something like a drop forge or steam hammer or something. You certainly knew that you were on the edge of, you know, heavy industry.
Everything in their music was kind of alienated, and, you know, the music that comes from people who are kind of divorced from any kind of natural life, any natural rhythms, the music for a kind of hostile environment.
If I've ever been asked to explain that movement, I always call it the alienated synthesists. And, you know, Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, Joy Division, who were a little bit less obviously synthy. Everyone was sort of like that. We were all going around in long coats from second-hand shops and saying how terrible things were with a synth.
Across the Pennines, another pocket of alienated synthesists dreamt of an electronic future in the spiritual home of British pop music.
We are in Matthew Street in Liverpool, and I'm actually standing outside of the door to what used to be Eric's Club, which is where we played our first gig, where we invented OMD to play at this place. And it was, of course, the club where we all used to come. The Bunnymen and the Teardrops played within a month of us playing here as well. This was a place I saw Devo play their first English concert, and all of the influential bands that we could get to come to town played here, apart from Kraftwerk, who played the big theatre down the road. And then literally 10 yards away is the Cavern Club. You've got Eric's and the Cavern right across the road from each other. When Paul and I started being interested in electronic music, we were very young. We had no money, And it was totally unrealistic to think about getting, you know, the big kind of keyboards that you saw on TV or on stage with some of the keyboard players in the 70s. My mother had a K's mail-order catalogue, and they had some synthesizers. Our first Korg micro preset was bought from my mother's catalogue for 36 weeks at $7.76 a week, I seem to recall.
This was the first synth, and we'd made the first 2 albums with this, you know, and it's like, it's quite a basic synth. Can you believe that's the record?
The major record labels largely ignored synth music, forcing bands like OMD to look to newly formed indies instead. In 1978, OMD would sign to Factory. A movement of sorts was beginning to coalesce.
I think the first wave of bands that sort of came out of the closet in the late 70s, we were all working independently of each other. There was no unified movement. It didn't all start in one club or one town. There was no gang of people who all had a manifesto that we were going to do the new British electronic music. It was small pockets of people in different parts of the country who were independently, obviously listening to the same things.
I did make an electronic drum machine, but I'd seen Kraftwerk with their sticks. So I thought, I can make one of those, and so I did. And so some of the early sort of synth drums was this sort of very Heath Robinson-looking box with all these plates on there with these sort of sticks with wires that we did the drums to electricity.
We were horrified when Tony Wilson said, you know, what you do is the future of pop. We're like, pop? Yeah, we're experimental, German influenced. We're not pop at all. How dare you call us pop? We were absolutely mortified. We couldn't see it at all. Totally by accident, Paul and I guess others at the time, had distilled the electronic experimentation and the kind of glam pop of Britain from just a few years earlier into what was going to become, which didn't seem at the time, but was going to become the future of pop music.
By the start of 1979, the future of pop music seemed a long way off, as the combined efforts of the Normal, OMD and the Human League had failed to trouble the charts. But dabbling in synthesizers was becoming increasingly de rigueur, even for dyed-in-the-wool punks. At the other end of the East Lancs Road, another Factory band, who would become one of the greatest electronic acts, were taking their first synthetic steps.
The first synthesizer we had in Joy Division was a little thing called a Transcendent 2000, and I actually built it from a load of components. At the time, I had insomnia and I couldn't sleep very well. So I used to get this magazine called Electronics Today or something like that, and in it was this synthesizer. And if you were to buy one in those days, it was incredibly expensive, and we didn't have any money. So I thought, well, this is really cheap. It's only like 200 quid, and how difficult can it be to build it? And it was like soldering components in, you know, by hand. It took about 2 months of doing that, and then it didn't work incredibly well, you know. I remember we went to write a track in a studio called Cargo in Rochdale, and when we went in, we found a little Woolworths organ that you switched the battery power, switched it on, and it blew a fan. You could play chord buttons on it, so I was messing about with these chord buttons, and then Martin Hannett, I think, had brought in a Selena string synth, and you can play more than one note at a time on it. So I got the organ and the synthesizer and hit these chord buttons and wrote Atmosphere, Joy Division track, and just seemed to write it there in the studio. I think we wrote the music, and then Ian wrote the words that night, and then recorded the vocals the next day, which is amazing when I think about it now.
Whilst it seemed the North had the lead in post-punk synth pioneers, things were also stirring down south. John Fox was the former lead singer of Ultravox. He worked in Shoreditch, in London's then unfashionable East End.
These modular synths were the first generation, really, of working synthesizers. And then the companies decided to make a cheap version of it because no one could afford these, or very few people could afford those. And they condensed all that down into this. London seemed almost empty in the 70s. I used to walk around the streets and there were newspapers blowing around and a car in the distance and grey concrete walls, and everything seemed gritty and lost somehow, like we'd lost direction. And I wondered what that was about. I wasn't angry about it anymore, as we were supposed to be as punks. I just wanted to make music for it, the kind of music that I could hear.
Standing in the dark, watching you glow, lifting a receiver. Nobody I know.
Underpass is such a Ballardian idea, you know, the underpass with the sodium lights, and you might be mugged, and it's you know, very 70s dystopian. The spectral city.
This was the industrial bit of London that had served the docks and done some manufacturing, and both of which had gone. It was like living in a Quatermass movie, because I realised and discovered that underneath all this area are the plague pits, where the bodies were thrown. So that inevitably leaks into the music. That's why a lot of my music's so dark, I think. It's because I come from Lancashire, and where did I end up but in a place even more sinister?
Fox's music wasn't the only synthetic portrait of the 70s metropolis. An experimental group of artists known as Throbbing Gristle had been forging their own electronic industrial sounds in their Death Factory down the road in Hackney.
Grim.
Yeah, it was grim. It was very run down. The factory was an old trouser factory, and it was near London Fields. And in the basement, we were on level with the plague pits. That's why it got called the Death Factory. There was still a lot of sort of antagonism left over from, I know it sounds like unbelievable, post-war, because there were still people there, like the park keeper, who used to be one of Mosley's brown shirts.
I mean, it sounds a bit of a cliche now, but at the time we were trying to sort of reflect the sounds around us in some weird way. Our studio was in like an industrial area, and there were lots of different noises going on all the time. And we were sort of trying to reflect all these sounds and the way they all come together into like this weird mishmash of electronic experimental textures. We felt kinship with a lot of bands, didn't we? Especially sort of Sheffield bands. And...
Yeah, Cabaret Voltaire, those people. Yeah. But I think the kinship was the fact that we were all independent.
Chris Carter in Throbbing Gristle was a sort of nut for Tangerine Dream and that kind of music. So they were sort of some hypnotic, dreamy, electronic Throbbing Gristle tracks that were actually quite sort of pretty in a funny sort of misshapen way.
And I had these synths. And because they were homemade synths, they weren't bought sort of off the shelf, they weren't Rolands and Korgs, they sounded quite unique anyway. They didn't sound like regular synths. And then I built this effects unit. I saw this design in Practical Electronics, and you could combine all the effects together and put a guitar through it or a voice or anything. So I started building these units for Throbbing Gristle and called them Gristleizers. We were never punk, we're not punk, we were industrial. We're an industrial experimental music band.
Come 1979, British electronic music was still being ignored by mainstream labels. So Dan Miller founded Britain's first electronic indie, Mute, to release recordings by kindred spirit Fag Gadget, as well as his own work.
I wasn't interested in rock and rock music at all at that point. I really only was interested in electronic music. And I thought that was the future of where exciting music was going to come from, and I wanted to be part of promoting that.
One of Mute's first releases would be strangely prescient.
I came across an old Chuck Berry songbook that I had at home, and I thought, I wonder what that sounds like done on synthesizers.
Long distance information, give me Memphis, Tennessee. Help me find a party, trying to get in touch with me.
Everyone said, you've got to release it, it's amazing, you know. And I thought, okay, what shall I do? Because I don't think it doesn't kind of fit in under the normal kind of name. And then I just thought, well, what about if there was a group that were all teenagers and their first choice of instrument was a synthesizer rather than a guitar? Because that hadn't happened yet. John Peel, I remember I'd given it to him, and I was listening to the radio. I was with a couple of friends who said, we've got 3 versions of Memphis, Tennessee tonight. One is the original. There are 2 cover versions. One is really terrible and the other one's really great. And I thought, oh, God. And fortunately, he really liked mine. He played it twice. That was one of the biggest moments of in my entire career in the music.
And that's the end of tonight's programme, in which you heard the Desperate Bicycles, the Slits, the Mekons, Alternative TV, the UK Subs and Sham 69. More of the same unpleasant and disorientating racket on tomorrow night's programme. Until then, from me, John Peel, good night and good riddance.
Getting your record on the Peel Show was one thing, but nobody was ready for what happened next.
What sort of makeup do you put on? I mean, you appear very white.
Well, it's all natural, actually. It's Max Factor is a pan stick, and it's 28, which is just natural. It's not a white makeup, it's normal. And then I just powder that with skin tone powder, and then just eyeliner.
On the 24th of May 1979, the future finally arrived. He was a punk. He loved sci-fi. He even read J.G. Ballard. But most impressively, Gary Newman was on top of the pops.
I wish magic was real. Yeah. I wish fairies were real and all that kind of stuff. I love all that sort of thing. Probably never grew up, I suppose, from that point of view.
The first time he was on Top of the Pops, I think either she phoned me or I phoned her. Are you watching this? Have you seen this man? He's fantastic, you know? The look and the sound was so different, sort of alien, wasn't it?
I was in a lot of trouble at school. I was sent to child psychiatrists and things like that, which turned out to be apparently Asperger's. Felt more comfortable on my own. The classic loner, I suppose. You know, didn't go out drinking, didn't go out clubbing too much. I went to a studio to make a punk album, which would have been my first album. And when I got there, in the corner of the studio, there was a mini Moog. Luckily, it had been left on this sound, which is a huge, big, bassy thing, and the room shook. You know. I just realised you can just press one key, and all this other stuff happens. You know, there was a massive amount of power in them and depth. I just never heard anything like it before.
People like ourselves and Cabaret Voltaire and the Human League had all just got used to the fact that we existed and there was somebody else sharing our space. And then along comes, you know, who I guess at the time we thought was Johnny Come Lately. Who the hell is this guy from London who's on telly and having a massive hit record? Never heard of him.
Newman was Britain's first synth pin-up.
I really like Gary's music. I think he made the best records at that time. I think he, if anyone, really condensed it into a form that was perfect at that point.
Newman would immediately show that his #1 success was no fluke. Cars was part eulogy to J.G. Ballard and part testimony to living in 70s London.
I was in my car and a couple of men in a van swerved around me and pulled up in front, got out and were clearly going to give me a bit of a hammering, you know, trying to get me out and kicking the car and screaming and shouting. I was pretty scared, you know, so I locked all my doors and I ended up driving up onto the pavement and shot along the pavement because I couldn't go anywhere. You know, people obviously leaping out of the way because I was in a bit of a panic.
Oh, I was gutted when Cars came out. I thought it was really good. All this time we were convinced, just a matter of time before we have a #1 record, because, you know, part arrogance and part stupidity. And then somebody comes out of the blue and does it.
With sales totalling in excess of 10 million, Gary Numan was a new kind of pop star. But being at the front of the synth wave had inevitable drawbacks.
The Musicians Union tried to ban me for, I think, the first year I was around because they said I was putting proper musicians out of work. Although I had to be a member to get on top of the pops. So, you know, it caused me loads of grief, actually. The music press were pretty harsh.
It wasn't rock and roll. It wasn't honest, it wasn't working class, it wasn't worthy, it wasn't earthy, it wasn't real, it wasn't sweaty, it wasn't manly, it was pretentious and pseudo-intellectual. And I am absolutely convinced that Newman's career was shortened by nasty, nasty vitriolic journalism.
But again, if what they've been before me, they've been punk, the whole anti-hero thing. So not only was I doing electronic music, which I wasn't particularly pleased with anyway, but I'm standing up saying I want to be a pop star. Love it. All this anti-hero stuff before that, I want nothing to do with that. You know, I want to be famous, and I want to be standing on stages, and I don't speak for the people because I don't even know them.
The decade would end with Newman as the unlikely synth-pop hero come good. What lay around the corner would see the synth transformed from post-punk experimental tool into the pop instrument of choice.